David, at the end of a really generative lecture, we got a question that was a little bit off topic, but it was a great question and I thought a great answer. A fellow asked, if you were coming into a youth group and you sat and lived with them for a while, what kind of criteria would you use to assess whether this was a healthy youth group, a vibrant youth group, a youth group that was alive and fulfilling its gospel mission? What are your criteria? What would you look for in a youth ministry?
Well, in the first place, I would say that it's a mystery. You know, we are called to be faithful, and I always have a difficult time assessing whether our faithfulness has resulted in any kind of tangible, results in shaping the lives of young people. I always have difficulty with that. But one rubric that I have embraced over the last couple of decades is the notion of Christian practices. Our tradition, the Christian tradition, is constituted not primarily by a set of ideas. It's more than a set of doctrines or sources, biblical and otherwise, but it is primarily a set of practices, activities that we do in certain ways and not others, practices that are that at the heart of the practices is some narrative that may flow from the Scripture or the tradition, but the Christian faith is a whole way of life, and so it is one way to assess, how robust a youth ministry is to look at how they're engaging the range of Christian practices. So as I said in our session, I believe pretty strongly in the work of Dorothy Bass and Craig Dykstra and the folks who've been writing for the past 20 years about Christian practice. We used to think that if we just taught the right ideas, then that would result in right behavior. But what we're learning now is it's a much more complicated situation. And in fact, it's more likely that if people engage the right practices, then that will be appropriate ground for right reflection on ideas. And so for Christians, there's a set of practices. It includes, of course, worship is more a gift than a practice. And we might say that all practices in some crystallized form can be glimpsed in and through worship. And we might even say, as Don Salyers does, that the practices are the liturgy beyond the liturgy. I like that myself. But the practices, you look at folks who, everyone has a different list, but reading Scripture, prayer, keeping Sabbath, caring for the earth, seeking justice, forgiveness, living in community, these are all practices that we try to give concrete expression to in and through our lives, in the church. And so I find that if young people, for example, are engaging the range of practices, they're more likely to be robust and be willing and able to think, reflect theologically. Now, for my own purposes, I've focused more on the practice of discernment, partly because it's such a neglected practice, partly because it is so urgent and critical for adolescents. But I find that the practices flow easily into each other. For example, if you, it's easy to see, for example, if you engage in, let's say, the practice of showing hospitality. I'm thinking of a community, a church in my community who has a homeless ministry, showing hospitality to the homeless. Well, at some point, it's only natural that they begin asking the question about justice. Why is there poverty? And so then they begin to reflect on the practice of seeking justice, and then that may lead them to other practices, practices of forgiveness, practices of keeping Sabbath in order to sustain a life of faith in the face of injustice. So the practices kind of flow from one to the other. But in the Christian faith, there's this enormous kind of gray area that is not addressed directly by Scripture, and we are to find our way in faith amidst the gray. And so discernment, historically, churches have engaged this practice in different ways throughout history. And it's simply a way for Christians to reflect together on how God is calling them in their lives, calling them forward in faith. And so that's the practice that I've focused most deliberately on in my work with adolescents, because it comes at such a crucial time of life where young people are in the process of constructing a sense of identity and purpose and vocation. And so the practice of discernment is crucial at that time of life.